This is Evan Clark. I'm Executive Director of Atheists United in Los Angeles, California. We are thrilled to host you today for Atheists United Live. This is a monthly speaker series we've been hosting since 1982 in LA. And we have incredible speakers that come to us from all over the world to join us for these events. And we've got an incredible presentation for you today. Before we get started, I just want to quickly go over a few housekeeping things. So first, you are muted. No apologies there. That is how we have set up this system. We are also live streaming this event. If you'd like to participate in asking questions and engaging with our speaker, please head into the chat section and I'll watch that for you. And then after Marissa's presentation, we will move to a Q&A after. Thank you very much. These events are hosted by our nonprofit organization at no cost to you. All that we ask is that you become a member of the organization or give a suggested donation of $10 for attending an event like this. We're completely member and donation supported as a community. And while we've been around since 1982, we hope to be around till 2182. And we're going to need your help to do that. So please check out atheistunited.org to find out ways to support Atheists United. Thank you. With that, I want to get us started here. Let's just hop right into the meeting. I'm going to introduce our speaker and then get going. If you stick around after our event, we have a hereafter party hosted by our board member, Klaus. We like to hang out and socialize as a community and invite all of those that are joining us for the first time to get to know some locals. All right, thank you. Let's get started. So today's speaker for Atheists United Live is Marissa Alexa McCool. Marissa is a podcaster, author, public speaker, educator, and performer, also known as the Purple Amazon. She spent the last 5 years working in the cross sections between the atheist, skeptic, humanist, and LGBTQ+ rights communities, using multiple forms of media and her own unique style from blended backgrounds. A graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Augsburg University, her academic background is in writing, media studies, cultural anthropology, and theater. A host of multiple long-running podcasts and a guest on countless others, she blends theatrical performances with academic material in a way befitting of her consistently neon aesthetic. The main focus of her research and studies has been in the origins of supposedly universal perspectives, structures of power and influence, and depictions of and representation in media. With that, I'm going to hand the meeting over to Marissa. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for having me again out there in California. What a great time to be on a virtual event. It's Minnesota in March, so I'm so glad I'm not in California right now. It's 36 degrees, so I really could have used some sun on my skin because the evil day star does not come out very much for the last 5 or 6 months. And plus, living in Minneapolis for the last year has been super fun. That's been something that's been really exciting to be around. So even just pretending to be somewhere else is a welcome reprieve. So like in the introduction, my focus is on a cultural anthropological study of modern myth and media representation, and not just the stories we tell, not just the movies we see, books we read, things like that, but who's telling them and who's focused in them, who are they for, and how do they depict others? I gave a speech 3 years ago in Lakewood, California, that was the first foray into this particular topic that I had done with a few months of research. And I've been developing it more and expanding on it a lot, pretty much my entire career in graduate school. So if you happen to have been there, you may recognize a little bit of this, but I assure you 3 years, I've been putting quite a lot of work and time into this. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Like I said, the whole idea is the stories we tell and modern myth and how they influence people. So in the event of some tremendous tragedy, which in America can be any number of particular instances on any given day, there's often a temptation to blame the event on a thing, Often this blame is utilized to distract the conversation from reaching a feared objective and is therefore beneficial to those who personify identifiable labels of the perpetrator. It's also not like this is a new occurrence. Anything from rebellious behavior to national tragedy have been blamed on music, drugs, video games, gay people, whichever political party the blamer isn't. It's an easy gig. So today our conversation will be the main focus of the last few years of my postgraduate research. Obviously, I can only summarize some of these concepts with the time I have, but the ideas revolve around modern myth, media representation, storytelling, and very importantly, the origins of the concepts of objectivity and subjectivity. I analyze the current political and cultural arena through the anthropological lens of the power of myth as it relates to current events and rhetoric surrounding them. I've studied both cultural anthropology and media arts extensively, as the introduction said, and I'm hoping my continued pursuit of studying media and its influence on culture will be beneficial in, if not explaining why, certain events and mindsets exist, then at least providing some kind of societal context in which they exist and perhaps have contributed to the overall influence of the current mindset. So I'm going to start with some terms that we use in stories, as well as talking about stories, theory, critics, everything like that. Story is a word that has a bit of baggage attached to it. The word is often used in a demeaning way of describing something apart from reality. Oh, that's just a story. Nothing but a story. That's not real. It's only a story. This disregards one of the most fundamental parts of our everyday lives. One of the primary functions that defines us as humans is our ability to tell stories, to bring to life things that aren't happening in the present. So to take out of what is going on in the immediate, to describe something that is not happening in front of a group of people, and for many years of existence of humanity, that was the only way we could experience personal stories. But even through media, the whole idea of describing what isn't there is part of what makes us human. A story is not only a narrative that somebody made up in a book or a movie, it can be as simple as telling your friend how your day went, recalling a trivial event, or writing and singing a song. Stories are how we communicate and relate to each other as human beings. A good story needs to be reliable because it's meant to connect us to an event, whether that's, say, how awful your boss is, or a fitting metaphor regarding a national tragedy. Stories are desirable. Even if they're meant to be pure escapism, there's still a desire for story. Our need to dissociate from a place and time is a desire for story not connected to the present, at least on its surface. But stories must also be accessible. While the characters and events may be fictional, or at least retold, they have to be relatable enough for the listener / viewer / reader to see something they recognize both positively and negatively. A story that one cannot grasp is not a story that the reader or listener is going to retain. It's a balance of logical and analytical thinking to see what is not there in the present and connect it back to the moment one experiences telling the story. Logic and math are how we analyze the world. Stories are how we relate to it, communicate about it, and understand each other. Then there's myth. When the word myth is used, it creates some similar negative reactions, or at least disregarding ones. The first thought that sometimes comes to mind is mythology, or at least mythology is something that took place in the Greek and Roman eras of history. A comfortable distance from beliefs that a culture once held makes it easier to look at it as storytelling rather than as religion or a belief system. But that's a different argument. Myth, however, is pervasive. It's near the top of the list of what defines us as a species, 1A from being the storytelling creature. Myths go beyond the mere telling of a story and transcend time and space. Myths are usually set somewhere else, whether that's a different time, location, or reality. Myths are often about things beyond explanation, or at least our ability to explain them in the current context. The supernatural, what science has or could create, or what is natural. Myths often involve non-human sentient creatures like monsters or gods, or even events that are beyond our understanding or explanation. Telling stories is what makes us human. Myths are about what it means to be human, or to put it in comparative modern terms, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a story. The concept of Frankenstein's monster is a myth. The plot, narrative, and 3-act structure of the book, or reiteration thereof, is the particular story being told. What Frankenstein's monster says to our society about artificial intelligence and what it means to be human in relation, that is myth. Then we have the other. Whereas the only way to communicate and keep myths alive once was through oral tradition, we are now inundated with myths. Myths are what we look at in order to explain what we are unable to, and in this process, we create a different creature, something that is almost human, something that isn't so inhuman that we don't recognize or relate to it, but also separate than us. When we see the every person contrasted with something different, the latter is known as the other. The other is someone or something separate from the perspective and narration of the story. Its separation is a technique designed to bind you with the perspective of the story being told, and in general, make the separate group the source of the problem, or what must be overcome. To other is to dehumanize, both figuratively and literally. In the figurative sense, this is why myths often involve beings like monsters, aliens, zombies, vampires. They symbolize what a concept or a belief can become if left unchecked, and are the counter to the narrative being told, which is either to return to normalcy or subvert it. Rather than taking a race of people, a religion, a political party, or just that guy down the street who yells things at you when you walk by, the monsters are a blank slate onto which we can project our greatest fears. When the other is not human, our sympathies do not lie with it. Our natural instinct is to want the storyteller or hero to survive and overcome the non-human threat to our way of life. Think of Lord of the Rings. If the orcs weren't ugly, grotesque, and based entirely on carnage, would it have been so easy to slaughter them by the thousands without a single second thought? The body count of the orcs in those films has to be in the hundreds of millions, but they're ugly, evil, and completely inhuman, so we don't care when they die. It's not just the myths and stories that are created where groups of people can be othered. It's doing so to those who create and perform them in the first place. When you can control what types of stories are being told and who they're about, it becomes easier to create myth that glorify certain philosophies and perspectives while otherizing and demonizing those that don't align with them. And finally, objectivity and subjectivity, which has been the focus of my research, especially in the last year. Colloquially in our society, objectivity and subjectivity are not only antonyms, but a judgment on validity and fact. Objective, as one understands it today, means neutral, disengaged, without bias, whereas subjective is interpretive, opinion, and subject to personal bias. Whether it's in science, journalism, or any other method of research and communication, it comes down to a scale of authenticity, of a perceived dissociation of one's personal narrative to the overall work. However, this not only disregards the power structures from which modern-day objectivity originates, but is often used to discredit marginalized people speaking out about their own experience. Those in power, be that socially, educationally, or economically, often have the privilege of describing their perspective as objective, while painting dissent as subjective, biased, or, in the modern pejorative, identity politics. Privilege is being able to have your identity and social status be seen as objective while categorizing others' identities as political. Even the word objectivity isn't rooted the way many people who insist on its utilization may argue, in that it was always neutral, self-removed observation for which many nostalgically pine. According to Lorraine Daston, both objectivity and subjectivity were more different divisions of philosophical categorization than measures of personal involvement. Quote, objective pertained chiefly to objects of thought rather than those of the external world. Traces of the scholastic meaning of objectivity can be found in Descartes, who wrote of degrees of objective reality contained by various ideas, and indeed many 18th century philosophical sources. Or to put it another way, objective and subjective were categorized loosely as the difference between, say, psychology and sociology, whereas one is internal thought of a person and the other is the study of the external surrounding world. While exploring the difference of objectivity and subjectivity, critical talking apology, Catherine Reisman refers to this perspective before arguing against it, saying, quote, the first person accounts occupy a contentious place in social science writing, dismissed as confessional tales and navel gazing by some, or empathetic fables or empathic fables of rapport, unquote. The supposedly objective observer living amongst the natives, writing about what they saw and experienced through the lens of their civilized experience, was an academic long-form essay, the subjective I completely removed out of what was being believed to be scientifically necessary. Whereas knowledge has been treated as exclusive, the inherent bias to access is also levied against the so-called soft sciences, which some hard scientists attack the subjective nature of, say, ethnographical science or subjective writing with the venom of being the enemy of feelings. To quote Paul Bohannon, scientists will tell you that feelings have no place in science. They're right. However, anthropologists and scientists are human. If they are alive, they have feelings, whether they like it or not, unquote. When the ruling class established a cultural and political dominance over parts of the world, the emotional distance created between the perpetrators of atrocities and exploitation are often necessary in order to dehumanize the victims of those efforts. To quote Bohannon further, your culture provides the perspective from which you view the world. That perspective works like a distorting mirror. While you acquired your culture, you learn to see everything in terms of the particular distortions it imposes on reality. In fact, every perceived reality is a cultural fabrication, so yours is necessarily different from the realities taken for granted by people with other cultures, unquote. If one treats their perspective like the only valid one in existence and puts down any criticism of it as subjective, full of feelings and unfair, it makes it easier to control the narrative. Otherwise, they'd be undermining themselves. We like to think we know when something is a story, and we like to think we weren't affected by it. While that does not mean we're talking on a one-to-one level like video games cause mass shootings, we're tricking ourselves if we don't think that stories have any effect on how we live our lives, speak to other people, or formulate our behavior. Me Too movement was a very effective and visible communication of stories of sexual harassment, assault, and violence for a few years anyway, because the stories became accessible so that they could no longer be conveniently ignored. It would be foolish, though, to say it was not met with its own resistance. Why is that? Why would someone be in favor of those sometimes harmful and life-threatening actions? On the surface, most people aren't. Nobody believes themselves to be the villains in their own story. Either the hero tells the story, or an omnipotent but completely separate narrator follows the hero throughout the duration. A great many stories in our culture exist that follow one specific trope. Boy gets girl, or a bit more specifically, boy meets girl, boy likes girl, boy gets girl. That's a 3-act movie right there that anyone hearing this can recognize, all within the myth of classical romance. But those are just stories, right? They don't affect the way we behave in real life. We can distinguish the two with relative ease. Not if you look at the commonly portrayed behavior of many with the beliefs that are associated with, say, how things are supposed to be. Following someone around because you're interested in them, even if they don't return the interest, isn't okay in real life. But how many stories have been told? How many stories have been told where that's the right thing to do? That's how you show you're interested, right? That's how you make yourself visible, especially if the girl has a terrible boyfriend and you just know you're right for her, even though you don't really know her or him. That's what boys have been told they should do, and that's what girls have been told they should want. Normativity's plenty aside. That is the culture that many of us were raised in. Another myth, the hero's journey, or a bit more specifically, the world is great. Something bad happens to the guy. Man goes on adventure, man makes things right. And in most cases, also, man gets the girl. That's most popularly identified in Jeff Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces. This is not only one of the most common and famous plot story structures, but for a very long time was believed to be the only way to make a movie. Now, in those stories, there's a man, usually cis, straight, and white, who lives in a place where things are amazing, good family, nice town, great life. Then something messes that up. His aunt and uncle are killed while goons look for droids. An evil scientist or millionaire disrupts tranquility in the town. Dad is killed. Girlfriend is kidnapped. Wrong is done. Sometimes to everyone, but usually to that one person who is perceived as sort of the audience XP, the one that's supposed to be relatable, a neutral objective. In most stories, it is that one man who must stand up to the giant evil that has caused this disruption. Sure, there are friends who help him along the way, and the girl, always a girl, of course, may have a series of characteristics, but She's ultimately the prize. The one man defeats every obstacle put before him, no matter how insurmountable the odds may be, until the villain, or the other, is the last thing that stands between him and justice, revenge, a return to normalcy, and of course, the girl. Anything from Star Wars to Taken. That's because those myths have become accepted as part of our understanding of our own culture. They're ingrained. And how in so many of those stories does the one man usually carry out that objective? By taking a gun and murdering absolutely everyone. These myths are so ingrained that anything that doesn't follow them is considered reactionary, subversive, and are themselves otherized in the language that refers to them. Movies about white men are called movies. Movies about Black people are called Black cinema. Movies about cisgender straight romance are called romance movies. Movies about queer trans romance are called LGBT movies. Movies about white men killing everyone are called action movies. Movies about non-white men killing everyone are called serial killer documentaries. A cis man playing a trans woman is called an actor and given a reward. A trans woman suggesting a trans woman play the part of a trans woman is called a snowflake. Wedding ceremonies for straight people are called weddings, where wedding ceremonies for queer people are called gay weddings. Political issues about white men are called politics. Political issues about non-white men are called identity politics. Issues about men's health are called healthcare. Issues about women's health are called the abortion debate. Think of some of the following phrases now that we've set this all up and how they might relate to current events, political rhetoric, and everything else that goes on. Boys will be boys. That's how boys show they like you. Good guy with a gun, bad guy with a gun. Everything happens for a reason. I want to note specifically that last one. Why do you think it's so pervasive in the minds of many that everything happens for a reason? We hear that a lot in religion, but it's the basis of stories that we've been told. That reason may be God, fate, destiny, a prophecy, but there is a reason. Stories that lack a conclusive ending are not always well received. Movies like, say, Inception or The Gray frustrated audiences with their story ending before a satisfying conclusion was reached. We like our stories accessible, universal, and most of all, resolved. That is how we understand the world. Everything has a reason, cause, and therefore a conclusion, effect, that solves the story, and therefore tells us that everything happened in the story did so for a reason. This is not to make anything a one-for-one. This is not creating a cause and effect relationship in the sense that seeing something happen in the story will make the consumer go out and reenact what transpired. I'm not saying that seeing John Cusack go stand outside a house with a boombox will make you go and do that necessarily, but the feelings it may have given the viewer may have made you want to do something like that. If you're a guy and you've lost the girl of your dreams, maybe you want to do something that shows her that you really care and want her back. Do you stand outside a window playing a song she likes? Say anything. Do you interrupt the wedding? The graduate? Do you propose to her at work? The newsroom? Do you run through an airport to keep her from going away to art school? She's all that. Do you tell her the story of how you obsessed over nearly talking to her 4 years ago? Can't hardly wait. Do you buy her a copy of her favorite book, hoping to find an inscription from her father? Definitely, maybe. Do you interrupt her flute solo by playing badly a trombone? American Pie 2. Movies can glorify going above and beyond in a single act of desperation through romantic demonstration. Does that mean you do any of those things in real life? Not necessarily, but they're portrayed as the heroes of the story for a reason. There are many stories of romance and growing up, but they all most of them revolve around the myth of showing someone you love through grand gestures saving the day, the relationship, and getting what you want. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy shows he loves girl, boy gets girl. Hearing that a friend has been hurt by a partner or even a total stranger, many instincts often cause people to go out, hunt that person down, and harm them in return, bring them to justice, or both, of course. Did someone kill your father? Hunt them down until you can challenge them to a duel, The Princess Bride? Did someone kidnap your daughter or little girl that you care about? Kill everyone to get to her. Taken, Commando, Man on Fire, Transporter, and a million other action movies. Are you disgusted with the way your own culture treats another? Join them and fight against your own. The Last Samurai, Dances with Wolves, Avatar, Gran Torino. Did someone kill your family or beloved pet but barely miss taking you out? Kill them all. The Punisher, John Wick, Braveheart. The most common stories in our culture at least until recently, have been the one man will save us all. That is how people either understand the world or think that everyone understands the world. Is it any wonder then when stories are told differently, those who have always had stories for and about them feel unable to identify with them? So many people have had stories told about them and for them. Why would they need anything else? Anything else must be wrong. That's not their story. That's not how it's supposed to go. Those stories have always been treated as universal. So why would a story for everyone be just about them? You're supposed to interrupt the wedding and that'll win over the girl because that's how the story is supposed to go. The one who will save us all is supposed to be a call to action when times seem their worst. And they are always the good guy with the gun. No one is the villain in their own story. Another example of supposedly objective storytelling is the historical film, but not every historical film, but the one that gives way to both sides of the story. The myth of the fairness doctrine here often comes into play, as debates are structured to show that both sides deserve to be heard and have an equally valid point, especially in movies where the objective is to humanize both sides of a historical time period or the conflict in the changing of civil rights. Movies often humanize those who perhaps own slaves or engaged in horrible behavior. But they're portrayed as just misguided humans with good intentions. And that myth can be dangerous for the victims of those mentalities. When a member of a privileged group sees active and ardent defense of people who look like them, urges can range from denying its existence at all to accusing the oppressed group of wanting an echo chamber where ideas can't be changed. Even stories where other groups or cultures tend to center a straight white guy in order to tell the story. I mentioned a few before: Dances with Wolves, Avatar, The Last Samurai, or a book that everyone in my school read growing up, The Light in the Forest. These are one of the most famous gay stories of all time. Rent is centered by the same kind of character. It may be that the stories has changed, but that's how, even through stories that are about other people, are very often centered that way and thus created as the true neutral, the true objective. And that's how the story are supposed to go. So anything that deviates from that is at the very least seen as subversive. I'm not saying that it's right, but it has an influence on discourse. The natural instinct is to blame a terrible event on the other, because everything in stories is almost universally cut and dry. To blame the other is to be the hero of one's own personal story, because stories is how the human experience is most accessible. Because it isn't inherently logical or pragmatic, anyone can project themselves onto a hero, and heroes always fight the bad guys, the others, the villains. Anyone who is not that hero must therefore either be an accessory, a prize to be won, or the ones who needed to be fought against. Queer people, trans people, people of color, immigrants have almost always been the other until very recently, unless it's to enhance the story of the hero for being so brave as to acknowledge that one of them is in fact human after all, an accessory. When almost all stories have been for you or about you, seeing them be another feel like a threat to that. You've been told you're the universal default, so why can't everyone just see it through your eyes? Because that's the way things have always been. The guy wants another guy instead? That's not how the story goes. The woman is the hero? No, she's supposed to be the one the hero wants. Trans people and non-white people exist as something other than a punchline or a dangerous other? That's just the radical SJW agenda. The stories have almost always been for a certain default and ridiculed whenever they're not. Does the phrase chick flick ring a bell? Where some people feel threatened that their stories are being invaded because they're not always about them, they fear what many of us have had to accept as our only representation, being the accessory, or worse, the villain. They fear not being the hero of the story because they know what happens to people who aren't the heroes of the story. And if they aren't the heroes, they might have to change. It's better to immediately dismiss anything that isn't for and about you and blame it on a vague group for whom it must be seen as a negative thing. If someone else is the hero, that must mean they're the villain, and we can't have that. Same as how if people don't have the chance to say, be a good guy with a gun because enough people are tired of getting shot, how will they ever be the hero of their own story? The most popular religion in America teaches that God made man in his own image. How can the image of God itself be wrong? Everyone else must be. Better attack the credibility of the one telling the story so that it will never have to change. Whether it's simply talking about making it a bit harder to get guns, it morphs into a total gun ban in the minds of the defenders. Non-cis straight white males being a protagonist is turning into some kind of all-out political agenda, or adults who constantly complain about this generation of kids always being on their phones and never getting involved, also turning around and attacking those very kids for getting involved when it's something they don't like. It's a violation of their attachment to a myth, a story. And all of those have an easily blamed villain and an easily understood conclusion where everything is set right. Unfortunately, as some people end up finding out, the way stories work is not always how the world works. Just because you relate and identify with a story does not mean it has all the answers, but it's easier to think it does. Just because that's how it's always gone doesn't mean it's how it always needs to be. Once again, nobody wants to believe they're the villain in anyone's story. So if they can control all the stories, they never will be. The attachment to those myths has never been more visible and prevalent as it has been in the last 4 or 5 years. And whether it's people speaking out about harassment or assault, or not wanting to be shot for the preservation of some kind of perceived threat and right, the long thought universality of those basic and retold myths have been threatened. As I come to a conclusion on my research, at least a summary of it, a question I'm often asked is, okay, we acknowledge this is a problem, but what can we do about it? In a few words, speak up. Speak with your voice, yes, but more than that. Speak with your presence or lack of it. Speak with your words or your silence. Speak with your money or by not using it. Make your choices to not participate as important as the ones where you choose to be involved. Silence and neutrality are not the lack of communication or making a statement. They are in and of themselves statements. Acknowledge where you come from, what you don't know, and try not to get defensive if what you thought to be your perspective to objective reality is questioned or criticized. I mentioned a lot of stories in this one. That's not to say any of them are good or bad. It's simply to point out that the way many of them have been told communicates something that must be true enough to a society to have enough people relate to them to make more like them. And that is how we learn. Not everyone is going to have that perspective. And not everyone is going to be nice about expressing that. And that's okay. It's on those who have the most power to use it responsibly in that manner to make a difference. What will your story be? Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Righty. Great. If people have questions, please hop in the chat and type them out, or you can type them on the Facebook live stream as well, and we'll try to find them there. I'll start off with a bunch I've got and see where it takes us, but thank you so much. That was, I didn't catch your talk in Orange County a few years ago, but that's one of the tightest talks I've ever seen. It's actually almost hard to ask questions because you've answered so many things here, but I will try. So one question I have when thinking about representation and thinking about how these evolve, like there's a lot of myths attached to, I think, as you said, the male hero, and the many layers of privilege on top of maleness. But like when we talk about the superhero and we talk about the super protagonist that kills everybody, I feel like there's this trend now of just replace them with a woman or replace them with an Asian or a Black person and say like there's no critique still of the actual capitalist structure of it or violent structure, solve your problems through mass murder. Do you have any thoughts or trends you're noticing around that? This new, I almost want to say neoliberal idea of representation?
Sure. And especially in the sense that there are so many stories that are supposedly, like you said, about other people being the center of them, but they're almost copy and paste, right? They're just the same stories, but throwing a person in there, and it almost makes no sense in context. And that's been a lot of problems with these kind of adaptations that just presume that the story itself was universal. And because we've changed the character, that makes it different. And as we can see with every Disney remake, just copying and pasting something, but being meta about it doesn't change the problematic nature and sometimes often enhances it. So it's not just about who the story is about. It's not just about who's telling the story. It's about who's writing it. It's about who's publishing it. It's about who's acting in it. It's a matter of one particular power structure not being the one who gets to control what the story is. And when a lot of people go into that kind of structure that has existed for hundreds of years, even, it's very hard to change anything other than what some people just view as a bullet list of characteristics. And especially in Hollywood, there's a real desire to change as little as possible because it makes money in a certain way. And we see a lot of that. And we see a lot of people who have gone to Hollywood thinking they had one thing and then had everything about it completely changed. So is it to be suitable or just franchisable or like this story or that story, but with this kind of person? And that's been a lot of the problems in the foundation of it. Representation isn't just about what you see, it's about who's making it, and it's about who's making the decisions about it.
Right. Awesome. Early in your talk, you dove into objectivity versus subjectivity and what that means. And I'd love to talk about your perspective of how that's impacted social movements like the atheist social movement over the past 40 years. Because I see a lot of ideas about what atheism is. As a leader of a local community, I hear this all the time. That is atheist or that's not atheist. And I'm almost always trying to show them that like your idea of what is or isn't atheist is generally like rich white male perspective based, because that's been the leadership of our movement for forever, seemingly. And I'm curious if what your feeling is on that and what you see when thinking about concepts of objectivity in like the skeptic movement and the atheist movement.
Well, a problem of a lot of conventions and conferences in the atheist community, not all of them certainly, but some of them, has been to invite speakers who are of color or are LGBTQ or even just women and get them to speak on just their identity. I can't tell you how many times I've been invited to speak at a conference and all I'm given is talk about being trans. And that's it. And a lot of people are treated that way because, kind of like how I was saying, Hollywood puts out a face, but then doesn't change the structure behind it. There's often, well, we'll get the Black person to talk about being Black, and we'll get the queer person to talk about being queer. But the main event panel is all the white guys talking about everything else. And it's not just about having a checklist of identities and having those identities be talked about, because we can talk about other things. People who are not those rich white guys can talk about things other than their own existence and their own identity, like I just did. I can definitely do Trans 101 or what it's like to be trans and atheist, but I have 4 degrees and none of them are in being trans, and I can talk about other things. So it's not just about who gets to talk, it's about what are you invited to talk about? Are you invited to talk in the main event conversation? Or are all of the really important conversation about what's going on in politics and religion and everything that's going on dominated by the powerful people, and everyone else is just sort of brought along almost as if they're, oh, well, see, we had that person here and we had them talk about their existence. So it's once again not just about who's speaking, but what they're speaking about.
Right. There's a question here about alternatives to the hero's journey. What are you seeing out there? Are there good alternatives? Is good or bad about a good way to even frame it?
Well, I think different would be a way to frame it. And it's important that stories that go against the 3-act structure, the hero's journey, are not labeled as subversive. Because if you look at Hollywood history, especially once it got to like Hays Code and that era of movie making, it was almost adhered to specifically that certain things had to be told, certain things were not to be talked about. The 1980s, for instance, is not an era of film that often gets talked about that way. But if you look at it through the lens of the most popular movies of that time, the end goal was either always to get married or to get your family back together. The quintessential 80s movie like that was Fatal Attraction. The guy strays from his marriage and gets a happy ending going because his goal is to go back to happy marriage, and the woman is punished for breaking it up, right? And that was there a lot because Reagan was the president, and that was the perspective. It was being harkened back to that faux image of the 50s that never actually existed. So who is in charge, who is in power is very often reflected that way. And going against those stories, it used to be hard enough that studios would not even produce a story that didn't fit in line with that 3-act hero's journey. And the important thing is to have those stories told, but not have them be seen as derivative or directly subversive. And they are out there. I guarantee they're out there. They're becoming more accessible through the many different ways to consume books, to consume movies, to consume TV shows. But very often they're referred to as, oh, it's the all-girl Ghostbusters, right? They're seen as that way. And very often ones that don't fit the 3-act structure are critically panned for bad faith criticism. So it's important to see those. It's important to find the ones that aren't following the same formula, but also are doing something different, not just for the sake of it, but really communicating something effectively. And I'm sure there are a lot of examples that I'm not thinking of right off the top of my head because I have to keep going back and re-examining the same ones over and over again in order to keep doing this research. I'm so happy to be done with grad school. You have no idea.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Awesome. There's a question here by a literature teacher who talked about students always accepted the stories as proof of its moral, and to be critical, they were talking about how to look at it from the author's point of view. So in literature, the teacher was able to get people to look at the author's point of view. But the question is, it doesn't seem to be the case in politics and social stories that we always recognize that there's an author's point of view behind that. And the question was kind of looking for your comments or observation on that.
I'm trying to think of a way to put that. Well, we are often told to see from the author's point of view, but I have no idea what K through 12 education is like now. But I know where I grew up in deep red central Pennsylvania, we didn't read any stories about people of color. We didn't read any stories about non-Christian people, or I struggle to think of a book we read by a woman even. So when we can talk about a lot of the times where people are told to see the story from the author's point of view, but we're often only given certain authors to have that point of view. One of my favorite memes is that I've seen shared around for the past few years is, I wish I had had the chance to read stories other than the existential dread of rich old white men. And that matters too. So the books are there. The books are definitely there, but what's seen as traditional or what's seen as the accepted classics are very often not what is actually read. And it's important to not just understand where the author is coming from, but understand who the author is within the context of their time. And we're often, not just in literature, but nonfiction. Specifically, my graduate school focus was on travel writing. And travel writing and anthropology for a very long time were basically the same thing, but it was very often a rich white guy from the Victorian era going into a culture and looking down at all the savages and their primitive behaviors in the perspective of, they haven't found God, they're not like us, look at how primitive these beings are. And that was seen as objective because they were a neutral person going into a different culture. And that is problematic. And travel was very often restricted to those with the economic privilege of doing so. And when you're from England in the middle of the British Empire, it's very easy for you to travel all around the world and experience things a certain way. But even today, it's very hard to read travel stories by anyone other than that perspective. For instance, traveling around the world during the Trump era was not fun if you were trans or Muslim or anything like that, but it was very difficult to get that. Because I'll often read stories that are like, oh, I went to this town, everybody was really nice, everybody really enjoyed their craft beer and etc. It's like, okay, is it safe for me to use the bathroom there? Like, it matters beyond just the author's perspective. It matters who the author is.
Yeah. And I think a little bit about the amount, good intended, people with good intentions around this sometimes say, like, I want to go read more women or outside perspectives from what I grew up with. And yet, like, it seems like the structures are so built. Like, I can't Google and find lists of travel blogs written by non-white people most of the time, because the first 50 results are all European and American rich people.
Mm-hmm.
So I always find it fascinating. We still have to do the homework, and there's a lot of work to be done. But yeah, the like structures of, even if you want to, how much harder you have to work because of hundreds of years of buildup of a culture that way. We got more questions coming in. This is great. There was a question here. You mentioned the theme that everything has a purpose, that theme. Can you say more about this? Is it a question of finding a different purpose or realizing there is no purpose?
I think it's a question of accepting that sometimes in stories, there is no right answer. There is no resolution. There is no ending where everything is tied in a knot, but we're so used to accepting that. And a lot of that has to do with Christianity, and everything happens for a reason because it's God's will. Or even in a spiritual sense, oh, that's your fate, it's your destiny. So we have to get ourselves out of that idea of thinking that everything does have to be resolved, but it makes us feel better when it is. It makes us feel better when we get to the end of whether it be an hour and a half movie or a 7-year television show, to go, everything that was introduced was wrapped up in a way that makes me happy. It feels complete. It feels conclusive. It feels like what was introduced in season 1 paid off eventually. And that's not how life works, but stories that don't do that are often rejected for being confusing or not following certain structures, because we've been so trained to think that's what a story is. So one of the best pieces of advice that I can give to anybody who's looking to broaden themselves, even to just what a story can be, is if you find yourself feeling uneasy or defensive, or it doesn't feel like it's satisfying you the way a story does, anything like that, is to take a step back from it and ask yourself why you're feeling that way. Try to get to the root of your discomfort. Maybe it's communicating something about the way you've treated people before, or maybe it's communicating something about something in real life that you really want an answer to, but you don't have currently. And we often use stories as escapism, as a way to feel like things are going to get better. But it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that stories are told one way and that's it, because people's lives aren't like that either. And the more we see that kind of idea represented, the more we can truly analyze how things work and how things go, and how different people really experience life differently. And it's okay. It's okay that people have a different experience than what you might have thought is so common that everybody's gone through it. It's not necessarily questioning your authenticity. It's not saying what you like is bad necessarily. But if every single person you can list in those stories looks and acts and thinks just like you, maybe it's time to analyze that a little.
Yeah. There's a question here. It says, coming from South Africa, I'm used to African stories that use the same hero's journey structure, but deal with completely different subjects and characters. Many, if not all, the examples you criticize are American. Is it possible that watching movies from other countries may be important too?
Certainly. In my sophomore year of undergrad, we had a filmmaker from Nigeria, a Nollywood filmmaker, come in. And I can just remember the look on the other students' faces as he completely blew their mind about what a movie can be. He would walk up to someone and say, tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. Oh, you lost your shoes. Okay, that's a movie. You lost your shoes. That's a movie. Because movies are not only made differently, but they're made faster very often. And they're made basically about anything in certain places and in certain countries. So seeing how not just Americanized foreign movies, like say Slumdog Millionaire, what movies are they watching there? What are the pop culture movies, the pulp fiction movies that they watch? Seeing what another culture watches that like everybody sees can be useful. Seeing the equivalent of Real Housewives in another country might tell you a lot more about that culture than watching something that is produced and distributed by someone still in America, because in a way it's kind of navel gazing to think of it that way. But watch what other people make for themselves, and that will tell you a lot about the differences in the culture and the differences in what they enjoy, what the people are actually like, as opposed to the Americanized versions of them.
Yeah. This question might need some unpacking, but it says, should we cancel stories that are not politically correct or demeaning? For example, Huckleberry Finn.
It's not about canceling, I don't think. It's more about understanding the context. I think part of it is that, but also there are other stories from that time than Huck Finn, right? There are stories about people who are represented in certain ways that are not just the other like that. I'm not saying that we should get rid of stories like that. I'm saying that other stories need to be told. Canceling stories, I'm not going to sit here and say that we need to get rid of all the ones that are problematic, because we wouldn't have a lot of stories left if we did that. But we need to acknowledge that many stories are only told from a certain perspective, and if other people are mentioned, they're the object of that gaze. And I'm far more interested in reading how people who weren't Mark Twain or people who didn't have easy access to publishers told their stories in that time. And obviously that's difficult given social, economical, political status and who had access, but they're out there.
Yeah, do you feel like when we talk about canceling people, I feel like it almost is blown to the point where it's like we're gonna literally burn the entire idea and every symbol and word attached to it off the face of the planet. And in reality, when we're talking about Confederate flags, it's like they belong in certain types of museums or something, not on like state grounds, right? They shouldn't be in privileged positions.
It's a matter of escalation, and it's intentional. It's very often intentional escalation to put the focus back on the other person for appearing ridiculous, because the other person is reacting to a ridiculous level. They're turning into caricatures to dismiss what you're talking about and change the focus of the conversation. And the whole idea of canceling things, if you went 5 years ago and swapped out the words politically correct or PC for cancel culture, it's the exact same argument. This argument has been going on endlessly and without fail. It's the same thing with different words. So nobody is talking about removing things from the planet. It's often someone who goes, hey, this is kind of shitty. And I question who made it and how defensive they are over it. Maybe I really don't want to deal with that. And someone goes, oh, so you're just going to cancel everything now? It's often escalated to that way. And then someone has to be on the defensive and say, no, I'm not talking about getting rid of everything. As someone who has been the direct target of a relatively famous author recently who hasn't had great things to say about my community and has 15 million followers on Twitter, even just bringing it up can instantly bring people, I just like the story. I separated from the author. It immediately escalates to how dare you question my story and say that you don't want to deal with that author or what that author created. So once again, it's usually escalation to change or distract from an actual conversation, but it's not new. It's just with different words now.
Right. You get a lot of comments. People really are interested in Nollywood now. They didn't know about Nollywood, and they're very excited to learn
And
more.
Nollywood's awesome. It really is.
That's great. There was a comment, more than a question, if you want to engage it. European movie makers have a lot more tolerance for ambiguity than Americans, was the comment.
Yeah. I understand that not everybody can take world cinema classes that are taught by Europeans or taught by people not from America. But wow, did that open my mind a lot when I took at UPenn a class taught by someone of Slovenian ancestry and was an immigrant. And none of the movies we watched were American or in English. And just knowing that they existed was such an amazing experience. I remember watching 3.5-hour movie done by Inuit people, and it was not like nothing I've ever seen. And I wish I could remember the name of it. That was like 6 years ago now. But to just access stories that aren't the one or two that's about an anglicized person experiencing that culture, but actually made by a culture or a country or a group of people for themselves, like I said before, that is where you can really start to see some of those stories that are very differently structured, very differently filmed, very differently presented, and ones that are not really adhering to the norms that we don't get to see a lot of in our own distributive services or even really know what to look for.
Right. Is there, when there is strong cultural differences, not to say we shouldn't just go in head first and experience radically different cultural art and story, but is there any research that or ideas around like people find it more accessible to almost like experience anthropological storytelling, like getting essentially like there are a lot of white people trying to study the Inuit, and so they tell the story from their white experience as like an outsider, but they're trying to get close to it rather than just completely documenting what the, let's say, Inuit are doing. Is that valuable? Is that important? Is there any research that talks about like that helps persuade people and empathize still because it's like you're at least connected to the person telling the story?
It can be a very powerful method of starting a conversation, right? One of the most important examples recently has been, say, the book White Fragility. It's written by a white person talking directly to white people.
Right.
The whole idea is to not stop there. It's supposed to be something that drives you to go find more of those voices and listen to them, not just to go, oh, well, I read that, I understand it now. use it as a jumping off point. If that's what helps you find out that another culture exists or that a different type of people or a different type of behavior or version of history, if that's what helps you find out it exists, cool. But don't just stop right there and end it. There's plenty of material and plenty of research you can do on your own or with somebody who maybe has access to ProQuest or something like that to find out not just about those people, but about the context that surrounds it and maybe the context of when the story was made. The same way that we were talking about literature before, about the context of the author's perspective. That exists for movies as well and different cultures as well. It may be harder to access it or to know where to look, of course, because we're not taught to do that, but it's out there. It's really just learning how to find that kind of material. And I'm probably not the best person to figure that out because a lot of those things I just happen to have through being one of the lucky token poor kids to get into Penn. So, you get into a system like that where everybody's just kind of used to having that kind of access, and you're going, wow, there's 7 libraries here and I can read anything I want. Like it's a matter of there's certain people in certain places that have a lot of access, and they don't realize that most people don't. And that's part of that perspective problem. If you're only around people like you, and you're only around people in the same socioeconomic class, I can give a perfect example. Like, I think they let maybe 400 community college transfers into Penn, and it's a 20,000 student university. So not exactly well represented, but I remember sitting right before spring break sophomore year, and the person next to me goes, I think I'm going to go to Switzerland for spring break. What are you going to do? I'm going to work. It's just, if you're only around people who have that same kind of access, you're often unaware that there are different versions, or that people live differently. Even I drove for Uber for a semester, and Center City, Philadelphia has places that Penn students typically don't go. And I would pick people up from Temple, and some of them would be like, you left campus? Did you get shot at? It's like, really? Do you ever walk to 30th Street Station? Like, it's just very insulated.
Right. So looking at maybe getting a little bit more macro, I mean, thinking about the past 100 years and the influence of Western media and politics, essentially, like we're even seeing the decimation of a lot of languages around the world right now. When you look at the next 100 years, do you see bright spots for how like people recapture their story, not recapture, but like, and have more power behind their story than what has been done in the past? And or what do we need to do to work on those systems to make that more possible?
Access to preservation is huge. I can think of one. It was even in a movie I mentioned, Dances with Wolves. There was a professor who spoke the language that was used in that movie, and was the voice coach on everybody else who spoke it. And the names are escaping me right now, so forgive me for that. But the fact that so much of that was caught on film, and that so many different people got to meet that person, and so many people have learned from that person, it was preserved on video, because she's unfortunately since passed. But technology is doing amazing things for preserving things like that. Like, if we had recording technology 300 years ago, there's no telling how many languages or cultures that have been since removed from access or existence that would have been forever preserved. And there's obviously ways through more physical anthropology than cultural to access that, but you can only do so much with annaled records and excavating sites. But the more people who have access to recording, to video, to YouTube, to podcasting, forms of new media, the more people who have access to them can preserve their own history, and can preserve them talking about their own history, as opposed to someone disseminating it. And I see a lot of hope in that kind of access and that kind of level of preservation that can happen through simply turning a camera on.
Yeah. Let's make this the last question. With more stories, books, movies, etc., being produced and available now by more voices from more cultures than ever before, what's the best way to find those stories?
I would say personally, ask people who are from that kind of background, or at least maybe have connections with or have found it themselves. Like, people will often come to me and ask, what's a good trans story, or what's a good trans book? And that's something I can at least begin to point people towards, ones that aren't told or portrayed by people who aren't us, tend to be different than the ones that are. And I can point people toward that. But I won't sit here and pretend to be experts on a lot of the other cultures and styles of movies, and finding access to them, as I said before. But if you can, try to find what, say, people in Brazil are watching, or find different kinds of places that watch different kinds of things. Because we have those VPNs, those things that take away your VPN now, so you can see what other countries are watching on Netflix. That's a good way to do it. And when you say look up an article on Wikipedia, go down to the bottom, see where the sources come from, follow those sources back to maybe finding out what they made or what they're writing about, or other examples that they pulled from. Some of the best sources of material that I've found have been from just reading the cited list of articles that write about some of these things, and then just following those rabbit trails. And yes, it can be really overwhelming. There's a lot of information, and it's really hard to start parsing through what's good and what's not. But if you can, ask someone with that experience. If you can't, try to follow some of those rabbit holes. Try to find out what people in Japan are watching as their Thursday night show, rather than what we are seeing. So it's just a matter of, you got to look for it sometimes, and then you just got to figure out where that came from, who's in it, what else have they done, what else has this person written about. And a lot of times you can find stuff that you had no idea existed. And like I said, I fully admit that I had a very, very lucky happenstance to be in a place where there was a class called World Cinema, and I got to see movies from 16 different countries. And not everybody gets to do that, but they're out there, and they may be hard to find, but they're out there.
Well, in the comments, you've got multiple people inspired to maybe do a non-conventional or foreign film movie night. So I think
Good.
we're going to have to fly you out someday to help us organize that and be our star guest.
Sure.
So thank you again.
Trust me,
yeah.
Being in Minnesota in March, I was really hoping I could come to California. So I will never
put it in the
turn that
winter,
chance
no
down.
problem. Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us on behalf of everyone at Atheists United. We appreciate your time and the work you do. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
For everyone else, thank you for attending. We're going to stop the recording now and move into our after party. Again, if you want to learn more about Atheists United, please head over to atheistsunited.org. Thank you.